A very good afternoon to you and welcome to the Minerva seminar, Minerva set for the rule of law under extreme condition. It's a pleasure to host today Dr. Avichai Levit, who is an independent researcher but also an important figure at the State Controller Office, supervising or monitoring the Defense Ministry, so a lot of information. Avichai has a PhD from Tel Aviv University in Political Science, an MBA from the Hebrew University, an MPA from Harvard University, and he will talk about his latest book, the title of which, Deliberative Democracy, a debate about restriction of freedom of speech in time of war.
Exactly, yes.
Avichai, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I also thank the Center for the opportunity to talk today. I'm very happy to be here and I'm excited to see all of you through Zoom and live. We'll begin our presentation and then we can have a talk. So in order to just put us in the mood, I'll show us a short video, very, very short, to give us some background.
And in the early morning of April 6th, Congress declared war against Germany. Earlier doubts about entering the conflict gave way to an outpouring of enthusiastic support. A national mobilization effort called on every man, woman, and child to be loyal, do your bit, and help the country in its hour of need.
Be loyal, do your bit. In June 1917, Congress, 8 weeks after it declared war on Germany, it passed the Espionage Act, which actually deals with a lot of espionage issues, but also has two clauses that restrict freedom of speech during war. The Espionage Act is still on the books, by the way, and it prohibits, when the United States is at war, for anyone to make false statements with intent to interfere with the operation of the armed forces, any attempt to cause insubordination, and most importantly, to obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States, and to mail anything, any publication which is in violation of the Act. Now, during World War I, over 2,000 people were prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Half were convicted. A number of cases reached also the Supreme Court, which upheld the constitutionality of this law. Other indictments were also made during World War II. 1 year later, we're still in World War I. Congress also passed the Sedition Act, which is actually an amendment to the Espionage Act, and it prohibited any disloyal expression about the form of government or any language intended to incite, provoke, or encourage resistance to the United States. This was the clause which was also upheld during the war, and also any expression which advocates curtailment of production of products necessary to prosecute the war. So these were two acts that restricted freedom of speech during war, which were passed in World War I. Now, I want to just tell you that the United States is a case study, and in this case study we have 4 pieces of legislation which were passed during the 20th century, which prohibited restricted freedom of speech during war. Besides these two, in World War II, 1 week after Nazi Germany conquered Paris, Congress passed the Smith Act. The Smith Act prohibited interfering with the loyalty and to urge insubordination in the armed forces, but most importantly, it made it unlawful to advocate the necessity of overthrowing or destroying any government in the United States by force or violence. Remember, we have the fascist threat and the communist threat in the background. Moving forward, after World War II, which I'm happily the Allies won, we are going into the Cold War, and Congress passes, in the height of the Cold War, in 1950, the McCarran Act. The McCarran Act prohibited any person to perform any act that would contribute to the establishment in the United States of a totalitarian dictatorship under foreign control. Remember, we have the Iron Curtain, and countries are falling one after the other to the communist threat. So it required communist action organizations, which are controlled by a foreign entity, to register with the Attorney General, to report names and officers of their members and accounting of the monies that they received. And it established the Subversive Activities Control Board to hold hearings and determine whether any organization that failed to register is a communist action or communist front organization. So these are 4 acts which were passed during the 20th century in the United States, which prohibited restricted freedom of speech during war. These acts were enforced. People went to jail, and the Supreme Court, at least initially, upheld all of the acts. They were all found constitutional. Other national legislators in other countries, in different types of democracies with different types of government, whether it's a written constitution, an unwritten constitution like the UK, parliamentary, presidential, they also passed laws that restricted freedom of speech during war.
Which of the American acts are still in force?
Only the Espionage Act.
The first one.
Only the Espionage. The Sedition Act was repealed by Congress after World War I. The Smith Act of 1940 and the McCarran Act of 1950 were upheld, and the Supreme Court initially upheld it, but then later on, a decade later, when also the justices changed, certain clauses were unconstitutional, and the Department of Justice stopped indictments.
Indictments, or the law was repealed?
They stopped indictments. The only law which was repealed...
It's still on the books.
It's still on the books. I'll have to check that, but the Espionage Act is still on the books. And every once in a while, they're also talking about making modifications to the Espionage Act. The Sedition Act was repealed.
A lot of clauses can fit indictment of Donald Trump.
That's what many journalists also say. Yes, it depends how you look at it. Yes.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So the underlying question that I'm posing before us today in our talk, freedom of speech is a basic right in democracy. But during war, this right is restricted. Under what circumstances can such laws be considered democratically legitimate? Now, what I'm going to do with you guys today, 3 parts, okay? Part 1, I'm going to walk through the normative framework which I developed to this question, which I call the legislative deliberative democracy. We'll understand this in another 10 minutes. And then I'll give you a quick summary of the empirical findings concerning what happened in the United States Congress during World War I, World War II, and the Cold War with these 4 acts. And finally, I will conclude, and I'll also talk about policy implications that are relevant in our times regarding the war on terror. All right, we're going to start with part 1, normative framework. Let's look into what war powers say about this issue. So Rossiter, in his well-known study on war and emergency powers, said that wars are not won by debating societies. Many people agree with this. He called this constitutional dictatorship. In times of crisis, democratic constitutional governments are altered to overcome threats. Now, the basic idea is to defend democracy. That's the basic concept. So how do we do that? So in discussing the dangers of constitutional dictatorship, he said that if we restrict rights, it should be done only by the elected representatives of the people and only after full deliberation. Moving on to some more thoughts on war and emergency powers, we have the issue that democratic governments will do everything during war to survive. And this includes restricting rights. So John Finn, for example, says that we have to think about pre-constitutional principles. What did we mean before? And this includes reason and deliberation in public affairs. So we should articulate reasoned justifications for the need for emergency powers. So we're talking about deliberation. What does it mean to deliberate? Jürgen Habermas, famous philosopher, he did not refer to deliberation by name, but he discussed its basic principles. He had a theory that democratic politics is about changing preferences via rational debate, discourse. He introduced this concept of discourse theory as a normative model of democracy. It's a proceduralist view. It integrates elements of liberal democracy and the Republican view of democratic politics. And what he claims is that public opinion is formed in networks of the public sphere, or sometimes he refers it to as spheres in the plural. It generates influence, which is transformed into communicative power through elections and point the use of administrative power in specific directions by means of legislation. So this is discourse in the public sphere, which eventually comes out to law. Drawing on the work of Habermas, Joshua Cohen was the first theorist to characterize principles of the ideal deliberative procedure. And he maintains a lot of things, but among others, it has to capture the principle that outcomes are democratically legitimate if and only if they could be the object of a free and reasoned agreement among equals. So we're talking about deliberation. And you have to talk about the common good. No one's indifferent to their own goals and interests and desires, but only if I want to put forward a proposal, I have to think about how this will resonate with others. So I have to think about that when I conduct my deliberations. And if we go through such an ideal procedure, what happens is the aims, ideals, and interests that survive deliberation are those that comprise the common good. Manin was one of the first theorists to highlight the connection between deliberation and democratic legitimacy. A democratically legitimate decision cannot represent the will of all, but should result from the deliberation of all. He explains that when individuals make collective decisions, they don't necessarily have all the information. You're not absolutely sure what they want. But when you deliberate and when you argue back and forth, then you discover information that you didn't have before. You can change your opinions, and you're aware also of conflicts in whatever you thought in the beginning was the right way to go. Therefore, he concludes, the source of legitimacy is not the predetermined will of individuals, but it's rather the process of the formation. It is deliberation itself. In other words, a legitimate law is the will of general deliberation and not the expression of the general will. But, others have developed this. You have libraries on deliberative democracy. We're not going to enter that now. All sorts of models. But the thing is that they all think of it in populist terms. Remember, Habermas is talking about the public sphere. We're talking about everyone all together. However, I disagree with this notion, both on theoretical and on empirical or practical grounds. Why? First of all, Habermas refers, as I said before, to the public sphere, to public opinion, communicative power. But who has the power to make laws that restrict freedom of speech? It's only our representatives in legislature. Now, since this is done in the legislature, I argue that we have to look at the deliberation made in the legislature. whatever the public says is important. I don't dismiss that. It points to the directions of what people want, what they desire, what are their interests. But since they are not those who make the law eventually, if we want to examine deliberation, we have to examine the deliberation made by our representatives in the legislature who are making the laws. So this is what I more or less told you now is which is on the slide. So I'll move forward. So we have to analyze the deliberation made by legislators. Now, in addition to the theoretical argument, there's also a practical issue. I mean, how can you observe and measure what's happening in the public sphere among people? And also, as others have pointed out, citizens don't really deliberate. They have political discussions. You sit down in the evening with your friends and family, you discuss things. You don't deliberate and argue pro and forth in order to reach some sort of an agreement on passing a law. So, deliberative democracy, as envisioned by political philosophers, is not compatible with modern democracy when we live in modern nation states, which are very large. As Robert Dahl writes, in modern large-scale democratic nation states, control over government decisions is vested in officials who are elected in frequent and fairly conducted elections. So we can think about deliberation of a dozen people in a committee. But how can it work in the country? I mean, the demos don't deliberate. A key restraint, in fact, to deliberative democracy, which was pointed out by John Dryzek, is that of economic scale. But I maintain that we can reconcile the problem of economy of scale with the fundamental elements of deliberative democracy by viewing deliberative democracy as an aspect of representative democracy and not as a substitute for it. If you think about this, Urbinati, for example, she maintains that representation plays a key role in forging the discursive democratic character of politics. It is a comprehensive, you filter, you refine, you mediate the process of political will and formation and expression through representation. Reviewing requisites of effective representation, John Orr concludes that the fundamental task of a representative legislator is not only to reflect views, but also to form views. A representative assembly deliberates. Now, this is not actually such a new idea. If we go back to the 18th century, Edmund Burke, in his famous speech to the electors of Bristol, also made this classic statement. Parliament is not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, where each must maintain as an agent and advocate against other agents and advocates. But Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole, where not local purposes, not local prejudices ought to guide, but the general good resulting from the general reason of the whole. Mill also advocated government by discussion. He viewed the representative assembly as a deliberative institution. Opinions are voiced there, and there are debates, and then decisions are made as a result of superior reasons. So I say that the issue of economy of scale of deliberative democracy theory is reconciled by viewing deliberative democracy as an aspect of representative democracy, in which elected representatives of the people engage in deliberation. Since my case study, and I'm going to talk to you about empirical findings in the United States, and we began with those 4 acts, let's take a quick look at deliberative democracy and American national government. So, going back to the founding fathers, James Madison, he wrote in the Federalist that the efficacy of representative government is to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country. Joseph Bissett, U.S. scholar, he maintains that the framers of the American Constitution wanted and designed a deliberative democracy, In this case, where the citizenry reasons or deliberates through representatives, elections ensure that the representatives share the interests of the people. Cass Sunstein, which I guess all of you know, he writes that Madison regarded representation as an opportunity for the government, for achieving governments by officials dedicated to the public good, because representatives engage in collective reasoning processes of discussion and debate. They deliberate, and then the outcomes of their deliberation are related to the common good. Bassett defines deliberation established by the American constitutional system as a reasoning process in which the participants seriously consider substantive information and arguments and seek to decide individually and to persuade each other as to what constitutes good public policy. Now, in the United States, floor debates are, of course, the main place where deliberation is conducted. But bill sponsors explain and defend their proposal, others challenge them, and a response is accordingly offered. But actually, deliberation begins before. It begins in committees. There's a vast amount of issues. So the committees of the House and of the Senate enhance Congress's capacity for deliberation. Committees hear oral and they receive written testimonies by experts. They get information, and committee members then deliberate and talk pro and con the proposals. Over the years, congressmen have acknowledged, and case studies have shown, that genuine persuasion also occurs as a result of debate. It's not only about changing minds, mind you, it's also about making up your mind. You can enter deliberation as a member of Congress and think you're pro a certain proposal. You're mostly sure it's right, but you're not definitely sure. And then you hear different arguments, and throughout the hours and the days, you say, wait, what I thought is right. So it's also about making up your mind. Yes? What?
10 minutes?
I think so. I think we're about 10 minutes away. So in the United States, a deliberative democracy was created in which deliberative majorities are formed through the operation of governmental institutions as representatives of the people reason about public policy for their constituents. What did we say until now? Let's do a quick recap before we continue in our last 10 minutes. Government war powers, including the abridgment of rights during war, should be legitimized by the national legislature after deliberation. We began with that. Deliberative democracy theory offers an answer to the question of legitimacy of legislation in democratic political systems. A democratically legitimate law is produced in a process of public discussion and debate in which participants reason on the common good. Joshua Cohen, Habermas, others. But those theorists, what they put forward is not suited for the real world. We live in large-scale democratic countries. It's impossible for all the citizens of a country to deliberate. I regard deliberative democracy as an aspect of representative democracy, not a substitute for it. The concept of deliberative democracy in American national government also acknowledges the importance of deliberation about the common good in the institutions of representative government. So I argue that legislation restricting freedom of speech during war can be considered democratically legitimate if members of a national legislature, the representatives of the people, deliberated well. What does that mean? It means that during the process of discussion and debate, they reasoned on the public good, they seriously considered information and arguments, and sought to decide and to persuade as to the best legislative solution. Now, the question is, how do we measure legislative deliberation? So I'm going to put forward 5 criteria. 1, committee hearings. Were there oral testimonies and public hearings? Did external groups, individuals, and experts appear before the committee and articulate views concerning the proposed legislation restricting freedom of speech during war? How was the original draft of the law restricting freedom of speech amended as a result of that? 2, debate in both chambers. Did both houses deliberate? If only one within an hour with no deliberation said yay or nay, we wouldn't consider that deliberation. 3, exchange of information and arguments on the floor. Did the sponsors of the proposed legislation explain and defend it? Did others challenge them? Was a response offered? For example, a review of previous legislation which restricted freedom of speech. 4, public good. We spoke about the importance of the common good. Were arguments framed in terms of the public good, and how so? For example, the welfare of the nation during war. 5, persuasion. Did members of the legislature acknowledge that after considering information and arguments, they either reached their position or changed their mind? Was the vote partisan? Okay, so where are we in this presentation? I went through the normative framework I developed to answer the question, under what circumstances can we consider a law which restricts freedom of speech during war democratically legitimate? The framework is legislative deliberative democracy. Now, I will quickly talk about the main empirical findings regarding congressional deliberation during World War I, II, and the Cold War. Very quick, I'm going to put 150 pages into 4 slides. Going back to 1917, LaGuardia. We all have our heart and soul in this war, but because we have our heart in it is no reason why we should lose our head. It is our patriotic duty to remain calm, cool, and deliberate. This is the Espionage Act, 8 weeks after the United States declared war on Germany. In the case of the Espionage Act, congressmen took the bill under serious consideration. They displayed sensitivity to the issue of freedom of free speech. They narrowed the bill. There was a censorship provision which they took out of the bill. They drafted the provisions to impair free speech during war to the minimum they thought was necessary for the safety of the nation. I'm jumping over to 1950, and I'll tell you why I'm putting these 2 acts together in a moment. Communist threat. Humphrey, later vice president. I urge the Senate and I appeal to it to rise above the clamor, the hysteria, and the tensions of this time, and once again demonstrate to freedom-loving people all over the world that this body is the wisest and the most deliberative body in the world. In the case of the McCarran, House and Senate committee members gathered information on the way to protect the United States against subversive activities. Amendments were made as a result of oral and written testimonies in the committees. There was a proposal to outlaw communism in the United States. Committees heard information on this and decided against it. On the floor, members of the House and Senate exchanged reasoned arguments with the intent to persuade as to what is the best legislative solution to the communist threat to the nation's security. So putting these, moving over to the Sedition Act, moving back to the Sedition Act, the amendment to the Espionage Act, which was later appealed. In this case, public hearings were not even held in a congressional committee. The House scantily deliberated on the pending bill. Arguments in both chambers were only occasionally framed in terms of the common good, and an underlying current in the arguments that was advanced was an unreflective and war-frenzied public voice. 1940, the Smith Act, World War II. In this case, the extent of deliberation on the provisions that restricted freedom of speech was relatively low. There were other provisions which concerned immigration of aliens. Days and days of deliberation on that issue. On the issue of restricting freedom of speech, very low. There wasn't any real exchange between opposing sides, no serious discussion on the significance of restricting the constitutional right to free speech, no notable supports of arguments with evidence or information, and the bill was only slightly changed as a result of committee and floor deliberation. So the conclusion is that the Espionage Act and the McCarran Act can be considered democratically legitimate measures, while the Sedition Act and the Smith Act carried a lower level of democratic legitimacy. So I'm in the conclusion now, the last few minutes. So the degree of democratic legitimacy of laws that restrict freedom of speech during war depends on the extent of legislator deliberation on those laws. The more lawmakers in both chambers of the legislature seriously consider arguments and information, and they reason on the common good, and they seek to persuade each other and decide what is the best legislative solution to the problem that they have before them, in both committees and on the floor, the more democratic legitimacy can be associated with such laws. This is my argument. Now, this understanding has practical implications that are relevant in our times, and in the last couple of minutes, let's take a short look at the war on terror and the case of limiting freedom of speech online in the United States to combat ISIL. Modern terrorism targets potential supporters also through the internet. ISIL is a skilled user of modern online platforms, chat rooms, etc. Using the internet, ISIL has encouraged individuals to conduct terrorist acts in the United States, and people were murdered. Over a fifth of the terrorist plots in the United States between 2014 and March 2017 were conducted by virtual entrepreneurs that communicated digitally with ISIL. In the 2016 presidential campaign, both Republican and Democratic, Trump and Clinton, voiced views to limit freedom of speech online. Trump said, "We're losing a lot of people because of the internet, and we have to do something, maybe in certain areas, closing that internet up in some way." Somebody will say, "Oh, freedom of speech, freedom of speech. These are foolish people." But listen, Clinton said the same things, but with different words. Clinton, resolve means depriving jihadists of virtual territory. They're using websites, social media, chat rooms, and other platforms. You're going to hear all the usual complaints, freedom of speech, etc. But if we are truly in a war against terrorism, then we've got to shut off their means of communicating. In addition, some legal scholars in the United States, from the University of Chicago also, brought up the need to reconsider existing understandings on free speech, and there was a proposal to limit freedom of speech online by making it illegal to access websites that glorify or support ISIL, to distribute links to those videos, and to encourage people to access such websites. But my claim, I wanted also to tell you this, that even as ISIL has lost physical ground, we saw this just 10 days ago, I think, in Europe, it continues to inspire individuals to strike against the United States, as I said, Europe, via its online activity, and it uses the internet to advocate violent action. So the issue of limiting freedom of speech online is of continued relevance, and I claim that the candidates running for president and the jurists that have these different views, they're all very important. However, any abridgment of freedom of speech online must be instituted by Congress, and only through genuine deliberation in Congress, where the people's representatives during the process of discussion and debate reason on the public good, seriously consider information and arguments, and seek to decide and to persuade as to the best legislative solution to the danger of ISIL propaganda. Only then can a law restricting online freedom of speech be democratically legitimate. Thank you. This ends our presentation. So thank you very much.
The floor is open.
Floor is open, and we can answer questions, and we can have a discussion.
Thanks very much. It was very eloquent and very engaging, and obviously I share your perspective that a good legislation or a good society should be based on deliberations and mutual reflections and engagement. By the way, you have not mentioned Martin Buber, because Martin Buber, in his distinction between Ani Ata and Ani Laz, is actually in a way establish a discursive theory of democracy. But going back to your very interesting lecture, I have two questions. One, what if following deliberations and reflections, the majority decide to uproot democracy. So this is actually what Clinton Rossiter meant in his 1949 book about constitutional dictatorship. He didn't talk about deliberation in a way that you have elaborated in a very interesting and original way. However, there is a danger that the majority, following reflections, will decide to break down democracy.
Yes.
And so this is my first question. And just to clarify, I think that you are moving from constitutional principles of democracy onto procedural deliberations, and I think that it's an exercise with some challenges. And my second question is about the whole notion of democracy. It's not as much about Habermas, because Habermas is coming from origins which made him to pay attention to that. But however, you know, we don't have an egalitarian space of deliberations. We have socioeconomic stratification, we have stereotypes, we have epistemological issues. So people are not coming onto a debate with a clear mind. So,
right. So the first question, the second question, you're talking about coming with a clear mind into deliberation? That's
I'm trying to question the whole notion of deliberation instead of principles of democracy,
right,
entrenched partly in constitutional rights.
Okay. So thank you very much for putting forward these questions. And concerning your first question, my assumption, and actually the assumption of all deliberative theorists, is that freedom of speech is a basic necessity. You cannot touch that. So this is like, I mean, we start from, you have freedom of speech, and then you move forward to the next level. So obviously, this is in theory, but the normative presumption here is that there is freedom of speech, and there is freedom of speech because if you touch that, then you don't have deliberation. Actually, the minute you touch freedom of speech, then we can't deliberate. So this is the normative, let's say, a presumption, which is there as a precondition, which we must follow. Must meaning normatively. Now, concerning the second question, this is actually a very interesting one, and there is I know that there's also literature on this, because as you said, it's true that entering deliberations, people are not really equal, and they come from different backgrounds, and whatever you all the issues that you put forward, and there are also some deliberative theorists out there that have designed solutions to this problem. Since I am moving from the public sphere into the legislator, this is less of an issue, because in the legislator, our representatives are on equal footing. There isn't one person who doesn't have the right to go on the floor as opposed to another. There isn't one person who cannot vote as opposed to another. So once you move into the forum of deliberation in a legislator, then the issues of inequality they're put down. Obviously, among legislators, there's also different footings, but it's the basic problem of sitting in what some deliberative theorists call city hall deliberations. There, the problem is very acute about inequality. But once you enter those 100 senators in the Senate, it's not the same. It's different. So that would be my response. But thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yes.
You-
Hi, Shalom.
Hi, Shalom. Thank you very much for very interesting and eloquent and legible talk. I really was able to follow the logical argument.
Yes.
And based on that, actually, kind of trying to probe into the logic of the argument.
Yes.
So kind of putting forward a critique or a question that can be level a critique from an internal critique, right? Not from an external perspective. So when you do this leap from the populace to the legislative, right?
Yes.
Deliberative democracy is a deliberative democracy, or the discursive framework, right? Is a framework, as I understand it, is meant to provide or confer or provide us with a measure to evaluate the legitimacy of a government, of a governance system, of a way to govern the people.
Yes.
But when you do this leap from the populace to the government, you already presume the legitimacy of the government, and you leap over all the problems potentially, right, of representation. And I didn't see, maybe you deal with it in your, written, but all the problems with representative democracy and how it is in fact not representative, or how it obscures or silences or deprives certain big parts or systematically certain parts of the populace, right, representation. So once you do that leap, you hold on to the deliberative discursive deliberative democracy framework as a source of legitimation, where in fact I'm not sure that it can provide the kind of legitimacy confer the same kind of the legitimacy that you want it to do, because
If I just let me try to reflect what you told me now to see if I'm understanding correctly. You're claiming that deliberative democracy gives legitimacy to a representative government? Is that what you
not
said?
Exactly.
No.
It's a form of theory that discusses the legitimacy of a form of governance, of how we govern our society or our people.
Okay.
It can be through a representative democracy if, and that's the big if, the principles of discursive or deliberative democracy are held in the sense of the populace, right?
Because deliberative democracy usually the talk is about among the theorists, it's about what they call political outcomes. So political outcomes can be many things, not necessarily laws. They can mean other things. And the claim of deliberative theorists is that different political outcomes can be legitimate only if we go through the process of deliberation and discourse. Right. So you're right about that. That's correct. Now, what I'm saying is that if we define a certain political outcome, a law, okay, if a law, it doesn't matter that much what we say here in this seminar room or later this evening to our spouses. Doesn't count. What counts is what our representatives, whether in Washington, Jerusalem, Berlin, or wherever, what they decide is what matters. So what I say, this is a normative claim, is that they have to deliberate. They don't deliberate, then we have a problem with their laws. Now, by the way, this, I don't know if I'm going to have another question on this, but I'm going to put it straightforward. Usually, the problems of legitimacy of laws, we usually don't have them. I mean, most laws passed, people say, okay, and they follow the law, and there's not a big issue to enforce the law. I'm talking about these extreme cases under emergencies in times of crisis, where we have a law which restricts a basic right in a democracy. Then, whoa, there is something here that we have to look at. However, you did mention one thing which is an issue, and I do not deal with it, and that's the big question that you're putting on the table. how legitimate is representative democracy, period, in theory, without any connection to what we talked about now. This is a good question. And I don't know, I mean, I can connect this to a book which made all of headlines a few years ago by Jason Brennan, Against Democracy, if you heard of that book, so he's against not really, let's say not democracy, is against representative government and other things, and he claims that voters are ignorant, and
what I'm trying to say that when you evaluate, you're right, exactly. Yes. That's the point. That's the main problem, or when you assess the legitimacy of a law through the deliberative democracy framework via the parliament, yes, you presume that the parliament is legitimate.
Yes.
And it's not a question, you can pose it as a general question of representative democracy, but you can also, even if we assume that representative democracy can be generally legitimate, you have to look at the particular representative democracy and the particular time, right? So does Israel have representative democracy, really, or does it, skewed, or does the U.S., right? So that's the question that I think if you want to make this argument, you have to assume that the representative democracy is in fact legitimate.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yes, very good point. Thank you.
Yes. I share my former colleagues' praises. If you would have had an Olympics, you would be sent on a bow and arrow team, because you really hit the heart of our interest at the Minerva Center, the rule of law under extreme condition. And basically you make two claims. Okay?
Yes.
That in times of war or times of emergency, the best way to, if we have to limit right, through deliberative process. But
yes,
besides the previous remarks, whether those who are deliberating represent and so forth, so on.
Yes.
This is exactly the problem of emergency, that you cannot deliberate, that you have to decide very, very quickly. So, the whole theory of deliberation is very nice, but it has a shortage exactly in those points of emergency, when you have to decide quick, okay, and you cannot allow deliberation, serious deliberation, and what to do then. And the constitutional theory that is a supplementary to deliberative democracy is that there are restraints on even the deliberating power, the legislator, constitutional restraints that were made when we didn't know that we would be in extreme condition. We didn't know the Rawlsian idea, okay, behind the veil of ignorance, what we will legitimate to restrict and what not. And so I think that the constitutional review is a very, very crucial component, and I think that still you have some problem in, pointing to deliberation in the minute that deliberation cannot take place.
Mm-hmm.
But you have also a positive claim or empirical claim that those laws that were enacted after long and serious deliberation held on,
yes,
and not only more legitimate, but actually they survived a period of time. And I think that this empirical proof is very partial, because you can say the Patriot Act, which is the most recent American legislation in times of emergency, which was not deliberated. Okay, it's an act of hundreds and hundreds of sections with draconic powers, and it passed through, I think, 3 weeks,
yes,
something like that, after September 11, and still on the books. It was passed even as a temporary law, sunset clause, and it was extended to the Senate. So this is, in contrast to your empirical findings, that there is a correlation between deliberation and survival of laws.
Yes.
So this is the second point. I will add one third point, which brings us to contemporary issues.
Yes.
Okay. From the perspective of restricting freedom of speech in times of war, because we have to have a main effort, and if we allow people to support the enemy or to discover all kinds of military facts that can hurt us, it's justified to limit freedom. We are now in an extreme condition. Corona.
Yes.
The number of people who died from the corona now exceeds 5 million. Nobody talks about limiting freedom of speech of those who are, for example, putting forward all kinds of conspiracy theories regarding vaccination. If you examine how many people died because of those voices, and you can say there is a justification to limit their speech. Why we don't think about it in this term? War is one thing, and COVID or Corona or pandemic or climate crisis is a totally different.
Very interesting. Concerning one of the things you mentioned in the beginning, when you put forward your points now, about timing.
The theory of deliberation, okay, in times of emergency doesn't allow deliberation.
Right. So one way to think about this is during emergencies, then the executive needs to act fast, and the executive doesn't need that much time also to deliberate. He has the power to act, and he should act. But the problem is, if we want to not only act, meaning I don't know if it's a military move or whatever, if we want also to restrict the right of citizens to stand in front of a recruitment center and say, don't go to this war, then we should do this through deliberation, which takes more time. The question is, if we don't restrict the right to freedom of speech quickly, how much will it hurt us? I'm not so sure if it'll hurt us that much. Other things have to be made quickly. The executive has to act. So that's interesting. And then, I actually, and COVID, you mentioned also COVID, right? I haven't given much thought to COVID. That's a very interesting point that you put forward. I really didn't think about that much. But it is interesting. I haven't actually even heard of any proposal. Have you heard of a proposal to limit freedom of speech of those who are anti-vaccines? I haven't heard of anything like that. That's an interesting question. Why hasn't anything like that come forward? I don't know. It's a good question that you're putting forward. And what you said about the Patriot Act is true. The Patriot Act has a lot of powers, like you mentioned, but it doesn't restrict freedom of speech. It has privacy issues and many other issues, but it doesn't restrict freedom of speech, which is the focus of my study. But you're right that it wasn't
freedom of speech, at least indirectly. You know, if it allows the government to listen to all our conversations, it's a limitation of freedom of speech, because then we don't talk what we want to talk about.
But thank you very much. Are there any questions from our online now?
Hi, everybody. First of all, I want to thank again for a very interesting presentation. I want to ask, I think, 3 or 4 questions. First, I'm going to just follow up on Eli's question and your response. I want to say that during times of emergencies, there are things that go into the legislative branch and need to be discussed very quickly. It will not be it will be too much to say that only the government needs to act quickly. It is also what Eli, I think, has a really important point. He raised a very important point on this issue, and it's not only on the issue of the right of speech. There are other freedom of speech. There are other rights and privileges that are at stake. You can property rights and other things that during emergencies are very are a challenge to the legislative branch. Even the Israeli COVID emergency laws were acted in haste. There was not much time to deliberate. They were under a time frame by the Supreme Court. So I think that it's a really important point, and there's not much time to deliberate all the time. I want to ask about the weight of deliberate democracy, the democratic legitimacy of legislation, all the procedural aspect. I agree it's very important, but how much weight would I give to that if the final result of a law, even if it was deliberate and there was a discussion about it, and at the end of it, the majority, mostly in many cases, the same party that the president comes from, at the end of it, a very bad law will pass. So how is that? What weight should we give to deliberate democracy as a procedure in considering the legitimacy of legislation at the end of it? Another issue I had is with the one of your criteria was the public good criteria. I think it was number 4. I want to remind us all that most dictatorships are using this term of the public good. It's not something that you can say it's not. Most bad decisions during history were explained by the public good. And so I would ask about this criteria's room here, and it's not something that. Did you say some discussion where it's not explained by public good? It's not that will be also or some deliberation which was not explained by that. And the final issue I had is with your last slides. You refer to the CDA, to the Communication Decency Act, and the discussion around it. I think it was with the Trump, the issue of internet censorship and social media censorship, and all these issues that we see today. And at the end of it, it's not just war. There are different emergencies that we see challenge the CDA. By the way, it was not. It's still there. No changes were made to it, as far as I know, on this issue. So, how does different emergencies that are not war go into this discussion? And that would be my last question. So, 3 issues. One is the weight of the deliberative democracy. The other is the issue of public good. And the last one is it war only that, or every case we have today with the internet and social media is also something that we call an emergency for this discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. I think your first issue was, I remember you gave the example of, you talked about property rights as an example, which might be limited in a time of crisis. True. But my main focus would not be on such an issue. My main focus would be on those issues which are fundamental to democracy, such as freedom of speech. You can take the legislative deliberative democracy theory framework and put it on anything. in order to see if a legislative outcome, if a law was legitimate. For example, abridging the rights of property. But the question is that something which is basic to democracy and which we would see as having a legitimacy problem? So I didn't talk about this, but I discuss it in my book that there are, if we look at Dahl's, he discusses 6, let's say, institutions of democracy: elections, freedom of expression. I don't remember all of them right now. So if we have a law which in times of war restricts elections, or if it restricts freedom of speech, then I would say that we would have to have this after deliberation. Unlike other issues which should also be after deliberation, but they're not the center point of the fundamental question which I put forward when you restrict something which is fundamentally contradictory to democracy. What was point 2 and 3?
First, my main point, I think, was the issue of deliberation. It was 2 points in that first point. First, that it's not only the issue of freedom of speech, and you refer to that, and the other one was reflecting on what Eli also was saying, that emergencies put the legislative branch also in haste, in less time to deliberate.
Yes,
and that was the other issue in that.
Yes, you agreed with Eli, and
so
it's a good point. Yes, okay. A very, very good point. Yes, I confer.
Okay, so the other issues, again, remember, just to remind, was the issue of the weight of deliberate democracy. What weight should we give it? Is it the sole criteria, or is it just another criteria in measuring the democratic legitimacy of a legislation?
You mean the common good? I'm sorry.
No, I'm reading the issues deliberate democracy as a process, as a measurement, as you measure the legitimacy of an act.
Yes.
Is it a criteria which is good enough? It is you only measure things.
I understand.
This,
you said this, I think you mentioned a bad law. You said something like that, right?
Yeah.
Right. Right. So.
Is it the sole criteria? Does the deliberate democracy measure things only by process, and should it be at the end of it something that stands on its own, which is not it's completely detached from the principles, from the actual measurement of the final result?
I understand, and this is a very good point. And if we look into the scholarship of constitutional scholars, for example, in the United States, Jeffrey, I forgot his name right now, and others.
You meant Epstein?
Yes, and also yes. And others, they talk about what you're talking about right now. My problem with this point of view is that it's very subjective, because you can claim this law is a bad law, and another person can claim, no, you know what, it's not so bad. The person who says it's bad will give you all these arguments why it's bad. The person who says it's not so bad will give you all these arguments why it's not so bad. It's very subjective. And different constitutional scholars, when they also discussed these acts, which I discuss, and they use also subjective language. We passed the border. Where's the border? I don't know where the border is. We passed the border. It was too much. How do you know it's too much? So instead of these subjective analyses, I propose this proceduralist framework. So this is my response to the claim.
Okay.
So it's a normative claim.
But to what extent are we sticking to the technical aspect of it? Because I can tell you, I've been to Knesset committees, criticizing bills, and I was listened to, and I was answered and everything, and eventually ignored.
Well,
but they listened to me. I talked. Everything is on the record.
Okay.
Everything was discussed. I was answered. They gave me a lot of answer. I wasn't convinced at all. But eventually, I don't have the power, and the minority in the Knesset or any parliament don't have the power to resist the laws of the majority. At the end of the day, I think it was already said, it was the majority that rules the decision. So you can make an act. Listen, you can have an entire deliberation, taking every checkbox in your list, and even modify it slightly to make it look like the minority was listened to. And eventually, it's just technicalities. How do we qualify the actual bill, whether or not it fits democracy or not?
Okay, so inside the technicalities, we have an undercurrent of substantial issues. For example, we wouldn't look, if we take these four cases as an example, and open up the proceedings. It's not enough that the committee had someone like yourself come forward and give views. What views did he give forward? Did he discuss in detail, in an argumentative manner, and did he give information concerning restricting freedom of speech? So inside the technicality, we also have a substantive current. It's not disconnected one with the other. So that would be my answer to what you're proposing.
In fact, following Guido,
yes,
you mentioned Cass Zonstein. I had a big debate with him over articles.
Jeffrey Stone, that was the name. Jeffrey
many
Stone.
years ago, and I now must admit that he was right. The debate was about.
You can write something in it.
It was the beginning of internet, and Niva and I wrote a book and wrote that this is fantastic opportunities, freedom of speech. People will talk, people will deliberate, people will exchange views. You will get more information, democratizing. And Kazot, I write, no, my prediction is that people will lock up themselves in cascades.
Wow.
And will become much more extreme in their opinions, following, and now maybe a little bit beautifying what he says, but basically he said this is not great news for those who like the principles of our founding fathers, the deliberative principles. I give this as a
interesting
in exams sometimes to comment on. And you didn't really relate to the technology of today and the fact that we don't have deliberation of rational considerations and arguments as we understood rationality in the past. And probably this is also true for the legislator. The legislators are affected by the populist debate, and all your examples are from the United States. Can we say that the Congress today is a deliberative legislator when people automatically vote either if it's it's the most conflictual or Congress that we ever had, and There is no real deliberation.
מישהו שרוצה לצאת, יש פה משהו מולנו, תעודו אדומה.
אבל היא לא מפריעה.
לא, מישהו כאן, תכנסה מישהו שרוצה לצאת. טוב,
Sorry.
Yes. No, that's it's interesting, and it's also something which I've thought about how it did, if and how the United States Congress has changed in the past 20 years. And there is scholarship also on that issue. I think the verdict is still out on that, and because once you look into things deeper, it's not exactly the way it's portrayed in the press with the anti-partisanship. It's not always so high, but it's a very interesting question. I think the verdict is out. We will see. Yes, thank you for putting that forward.
I will check your card, guys.
There's another question from online, right?
Online from Shmuel Yerushalmi.
From Shmuel Yerushalmi.
The question is what need to be the ideological character of the deliberative democracy?
Okay.
Is it need to be capitalist democracy, socialist democracy, or social
Okay.
democratic democracy?
Thank you, Shmuel. The truth of the matter is that I didn't give this much thought, but offhand, I would say that we don't need any ideological colors. In the normative framework that I'm putting forward of legislative deliberative democracy, it doesn't matter if we're in a capitalist country or a socialist country. It doesn't even matter if we're in a presidential system or a parliamentary system, because at the end of the day, what we're looking at is the deliberation of legislators. So if a country is more socialist or less, it doesn't have any weight in the framework that I'm putting forward. Okay, so thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.